So the topic of today is cover cropping, and I really want to focus on, the aspects of the decision making, and again tie them to the regenerative principles and some of the ways in which we make these decisions. So let's begin in terms of cover crops and how they're going to be discussed today. So cover crops, basically, they include plants that are alive or dead residue. And why is it that, plants are so important here is they are the mechanism that connects the air to the soil, which brings in carbon and creates that whole carbon cycle and food for microbes, which is, a central component in terms of soil health and, what we're managing in our agroecosystem. So cover crops is a really broad term. It's a management tool to achieve soil health as well as agronomic goals. And basically the term cover is to cover the soil when it's otherwise bare. There are various times in which this can happen in relation to the cash crops or the crops that we're harvesting. We can have them in the shoulder years between fall, either in fall or early spring, and recognizing that's a significant challenge in your prairie environment. There are full growing season cover crops where the cover crop management is the primary focus as opposed to the cash crops. And the cover crops can be across an entire field or an area within the field if there's a targeted spot area to address in terms of the limiting function, or it can be within a cash crop, either underseeded or interrow, and it's sort of covering all of those. So there are various terms like green manures and forage crops. These are all dealt with in terms of this cover as within this context. So coming back to the principles of regenerative agriculture, the tool of cover crop really is important in terms of knowing the context. But from all the other principles, diversity, integrating livestock, living roots, keeping the soil covered, and the way cover crops are managed hits all of the other principles of regenerative agriculture. So while cover crops are a technique, the principles help guide us in terms of how we can use that technique to the best advantage in improving the function of the soil, regenerating our agroecosystems, as well as achieving productivity and profitability agronomically. And so cover crops also, in terms of using them, of course, fit very well in terms of the rural diversity. They fit very well in terms of disruption, particularly in reference to weed management. So when you put a cover crop in there that, breaks up the crop rotation, the overall weed ecology can be significantly disrupted, and sort of from fall or spring germinating cover crop or weeds and switching that back so that weeds are left guessing in terms of their opportunity to take the bare soil space or those extra nutrients and utilize them. So basically, if the soil is not covered with cover crops, basically a managed weed, you might call them, the weeds that you may not particularly favor your cropping system have the opportunity to fill in that niche. And then again, the soil function. in terms of the four ecological processes, cover crops interact in and have an impact in likely improving many of these soil functions. It's up to us in terms of how we've been monitoring and gathering our in-field data to determine which function may be most limiting. And so, with the energy cycle, as plants, cover crops are taking in additional carbon where the soil space may not have crops planted or a period in time of the crop planting. They're providing that short water, an opportunity for that short water cycle, and root systems helping to infiltrate water. They're providing cycling of nutrients, feeding the biology in the top growth as well, with the residue decomposition, as well as more so in the root growth. Some cover crops, such as legumes, adding to that nitrogen cycle. And then, of course, the multiple species that we can choose from are really good at augmenting biodiversity in the rotation, as well as the ability to integrate livestock, and as well as feeding above and below ground organisms. So we're at the point again where I want to recognize that for some people who in our first year cohorts, we will be doing in-field assessments, which would help us to identify what is a limiting function, and the cover crop, and in evaluating that, the cover crops might be something that would be in that plan. And for our more seasoned cohorts who have already decided that their limitation and their experience would lead them to have cover crops. Again, this is integrating them into the management approach, and what's going to be included in the steps of cover crop is to evaluate that and to replan. So this is just a reminder of the monitoring and soil data that we've been collecting that could lead us to cover crops. Water infiltration, soil compaction, impacting bulk density, soil crust and water ponding. That's with the absence of plant material there to help break the impact of rain and the fine particles being washed away by wind and water erosion, helping root growth and the diversity of root growth that we can integrate and with various species of cover crop choices, aggregate stability, and it's been repeated over and over again that the difference in terms of aggregate stability and keeping the soil together is adding life to the soil. So that's in cover crops, as well as cover crops that provide food to our microbes, that provide all those snots, slimes, and glues that hold those soil particles together. Something that is highlighted in terms of soil health is the soil organic matter, and I just wanted to remind again that the functions of soil organic matter impact the chemical functions, as well as the physical functions and the biological functions. And so when we emphasize cover crops, that's adding more plant material into our crop rotations and finding the opportunity where we can capture more carbon. This is the way in which we can build soil organic matter. We need that carbon captured from the air in plant material and placed into our soil through our soil plant interactions. Soil organic matter is something that is been degraded dramatically over time with agricultural production practices and with soil health, and emphasizing improving the soil organic matter, that cover crops is a great fit and a great start for helping that to happen. And again, reminding that soil organic matter is built through crop residues, as well as the living organisms that are feeding on those residues and the root systems. And for the most part, the crop residues are returning, the breakdown of that are returning carbon to the atmosphere fairly quickly. But the root systems are the components that are really helping to build the transformation of soil organic matter. And as Scott pointed out in last week's presentation, this has been a whole plethora of new research and a changing of understanding of soil organic matter, and I think it will continue. So, keeping us wondering and curious, that this is where the knowledge system is at the moment, that the contribution of the root systems themselves, as well as what they're feeding with the living organisms and the microbial compounds, we're building soil organic matter, more so from the root systems. So I have 6 steps to in terms of cover crop planning. A lot of this presentation has come from the work of the Seine Rat Watershed and the cover crop planning guide that they put together. The resources down here at the bottom, and we will be putting this on the resource list. So there's 6 steps in terms of knowing the goal, finding the window in the rotation where the cover crops are, you can fit those into your rotation window. There's a couple options there. There's a plethora of possibilities in terms of species, what will grow in your area, what's available, and then choosing a seeding strategy. There's many different ways of getting cover crops in established, and most importantly in terms of termination, because there are many strategies in terms of termination, but herbicides generally is very common in conventional, but is not acceptable in organics. And then evaluating and planning for the next crop. So we'll start off with knowing the goal, and these are split into immediate. So this is where you would see immediate results, short-term goals, and long-term goals. And I think those of you that have been in the program for a while have come to understand that some changes don't happen very quickly, particularly the carbon sequestration, and it takes some time to change some of the physical aspects. But generally, the immediate one is to cover that soil to reduce erosion from wind and rain, scavenging nutrients. And John had a really good example from last week to say, after he's put on a lot of cattle manure to really bump up his hemp crop, there's a lot of nitrates that are left over that are confounding his weed management strategy, because there's a lot of nutrients there that are available, and he's looking for a cover crop that could help to soak up those nutrients and carry them forward into the next crop, or at least help him in terms of competing against weeds. And then there's also the ability to integrate grazing. So there's a number of you that are already integrated livestock and grazing, and that's a really great opportunity coming up with off-calf funding, to consider the funding that are available to help integrate livestock with fencing and watering, increasing the ability of traffic to maneuver in wet conditions. This is, holding this soil structure, firstly with the root structure of the cover crop, but also the impact that it has in terms of the microbial life, keeping roots in the soil, increasing biodiversity, and capturing snow for moisture. And then there's the short-term goals and long-term goals. Definitely our long-term goal is to improve profitability and decrease some of our input costs, and enhance the organic matter and the nutrient holding capacity. So it's helpful to know in your goal what your expectations are and also what you're trying to address. So when we are doing those in-field monitoring, think again in terms of the management choice you're making will address that that constraint or the limitation you have in your soil health. And when you're choosing the cover crop, will it address this goal? So the cover crops, the goals will help to select the species and the management options, and they can be used in combination to implement other regenerative practices. So if you're looking to incorporate livestock as well as improving diversity, they're complementary, and that's helpful in terms of selecting the cover crop species. Various species will be better for the forage quality that you're looking for. So for instance, you might be choosing a forage type pea or a forage type oats, and you certainly have to consider the carbon to nitrogen ratio when you are putting together a forage quality. So those are just examples in terms of how they're complementary. So it's not a single kind of approach. You may look at your first initial goal, and then looking at the regenerative practice, the regenerative principles, you can also consider other principles that you can incorporate into your thought process. So just going to go through 4 goals. So if you have a goal to fix nitrogen, you would look at legume crops that fix nitrogen through the symbiotic relationship with rhizobia bacteria. And examples would be field peas, faba beans, clovers, alfalfa, and maybe depending on your context. I have a little competition here with my dog. Stop it. Sorry about that. You may be looking to sequester carbon and build soil health. So in that sense, you're really looking for a cover crop that has a lot of biomass. And so the cover crop shoot or top growth and the bottom growth to contribute to carbon to the soil. And this is where you would consider a mixture of cool and warm season grasses, legumes, and broadleaves. So a warm season grass that it might be like sorghum Sudan grass or millet or some of your prairie species where you really get a lot of biomass to contribute to that carbon sequestration. And I see there's already some questions in the chat. I'll try to address those later. So If you're looking to reduce erosion, generally you're wanting to look for a cover crop that has quick establishment and abundant biomass that can provide cover for the soil in the periods of time like fall or spring where the crop is not growing. And generally the cool season grasses like rye or oats are really good candidates for uh, for being able to provide that. And another one, just as an example, is if you're trying to increase water infiltration. So water infiltration is, there's two aspects to improving water infiltration. One is reducing the crusting on the soil, so that's where you have plant coverage. And the other one is in terms of the physical structure of the soil to allow the pore structure to be able to accept water. So again, that's coming to effective precipitation where you can receive as much water as is in the precipitation as possible. So there again, a mixture of cool season and warm season grasses, legumes, and broadleaves. So there are some contexts where you might be looking at a monoculture type of cover crop, and I see that happening most often in terms of fixing nitrogen where you're using straight alfalfa or clovers. And some of the other goals you're be considering a mixture, particularly with increasing water infiltration, because the species diversity with deep tap roots and fibrous roots and different root structures are able to explore more of the soil profile and have a greater impact in terms of that soil structure. So context and knowing the goal is very important place to start, because it's your land base, and your land base is different than somebody else's land base and your management plan. And so if you have several goals, it would be advisable to rank those in terms of, most important to least important, or short-term goals to long-term goals. And, this, did you complete this important step is then emphasize, because the goals determine when you plant, what you plant, how to terminate it, and the ultimate success of your cover crop. And these goals may change over time, or as your monitoring and observations may indicate changes are happening, or you're making progress. And it's really challenging to think that you're going to use a cover crop in your first year and that your organic matter levels are going to increase. So having expectations is, we always have expectations, and it's helpful to match your goal to those expectations, or expectations to your goal. The second step is finding the rotation in the window, finding your rotation window. Where is in your rotation, is it going to fit? That's going to fit your typical crop rotation and your harvest dates. Are there long shoulder season windows? Well, we've pretty much determined that that's a very limited opportunity in your context. But there are other opportunities in terms of being able to interseed or underseed into a crop. And then the opportunities for a full season window, I see lots of you utilizing that in terms of, you may be growing crop one season and full season cover crop the next season. That helping to keep ahead of your weed management issues, as well as keeping nutrient cycling going. So there's several options, and which window addresses your most important goal. And then after narrowing down your best window, is it compatible with your current or potentially available fertility program? So if you need to change up your fertility management, is that available to you? And what is the crop that will follow? And when we start to talk about C to N ratios, this becomes a lot more critical. But if your following crop is really hungry for nutrients, that's a consideration in terms of the cover crop that you're going to choose. And also it's obvious that the water constraints will really impact the window in which you're using. So as an example, shoulder season windows, harvesting the cash crop, and then we go into the fall, the freeze, winter, and thaw period, and then sometimes a shoulder season in terms of the spring. That's not very common for in a prairie situation, but there's the full season window in terms of spring, allowing the full season cover crop to grow, and then terminating it by grazing or left to winter kill, or you may be roller crimping it in the next season. Just being aware which window is going to suit you best. So now we've got our goal and our window. How do we determine which species to grow? So this is based on the plant characteristics. So the characteristics will help you accomplish your goal, and what plant species have the best combination of those characteristics. So we've talked about species that are good nutrient scavengers, as they might have lots of fibrous roots to take up additional nutrients that are left over after your crop, or that you're really wanting to amplify with deep-rooted species that are bringing nutrients up from lower in the soil profile, or there be legumes that are fixing nitrogen. So being aware of those plant characteristics. And it's also important to recognize if they're annual, biennial, or perennial, and I'll talk about that when we come to the chart. So do the species complement your current crop rotation? Certainly if there's a challenge in terms of your cover crop being a bridge to carry over pathogens or disease, then you would want to be very careful of that. And do they add additional diversity, which is quite the greatest benefit of being able to add cover crops. And what species are suitable to your growing season? So there are warm season species that do not like any cold periods or a whiff of frost, and so they would have or a more limited time of frame that they would germinate and grow. Or cool season crops, cold season species, which tend to be in our spring and our fall period, and may or may not go quite dormant during the hotter period. And then are you wanting it to overwinter or be winter killed? And is the seed, and then your access to seed, is it available to you? So these are all various considerations in terms of making a selection of your cover crop. And the plant types are broken into grasses, legumes, other broadleaves, warm season and cool season. So I think you all, know what the grasses that would fit into here, and this would be a confounding, um, part to your species selection, especially with the gluten-free option. So, or the gluten-free requirement. So you would need to have those grass species well away from the rotation where your gluten-free oats are growing. But grasses tend to be readily available, and they provide rapid ground cover and are good nitrogen scavengers, which are enhanced with legumes with their ability to fix nitrogen. And then other broadleaves are in here because they oftentimes those species have deep tap roots, like many of the brassica species or chicory, and they would also be nitrogen scavengers, but many of them also provide would bloom within the period of time that you're growing them, and they provide food or habitat for pollinator or beneficial insects. And so then these species are broken down into warm season and cool season. So putting it all together, the chart might be a bit blurry, but this chart is from NRCS, and so it's broken down by the type: grass, broadleaves, legumes, and also broken down by the plant architecture, whether it's upright and spreading, or lying close to the ground, and its relative water use, and whether it's an annual, biennial, or perennial, and then if it's in a cool season or warm season. So you'll recognize some of these are also crop species, but Phacelia, in a cool season, flax, flax has been grown in intercrop situations with other cash crops, so that could also be considered a way of getting diversity into your rotation. Everyone can see that? Make sense of it? So annuals, in terms of organic production, annuals can be the least complicated because they generally are winter killed. Biennials are plants that grow one season, they live through the winter, and in the second season, they go into reproductive phase and create seed. And perennials, they live from season to season. A biennial and a perennial may be more challenging to terminate and would require more aggressive tillage, and but they may also provide the opportunity to have seed to harvest seed. And so, like, Andy has got some species in his mix where he's able to harvest the seed, and that becomes an enterprise. So apart from monoculture cover crops, a mixture of species has multiple benefits, and it is advised whenever possible to use multiple plant species in cover crop mixes. This helps to decrease establishment risks most everyone's farm has different characteristics, different soil types, and if you use a multiple plant species, there are perhaps some places on your farm where some species will be more suitable than other areas, and instead of doing a monocrop where it does well in one area and is a complete failure in others, you're decreasing your establishment risk by having a mixture. And then also it's great to be able to observe that in terms of where you see certain species doing well. It gives you another opportunity to observe different things that are going on in your soil, and looking deeper into why that might be happening. And also having a mixture of species just ramps up that, increasing diversity to your cropping system. The flowering forbs provide pollinator food. The different rooting structures have compounding effects in terms of the physical structure of your soil, but also the diversity that is going to happen in your microbial community, because different plants are enjoyed by different microbes, and it keeps that community having working for you, creating different functional microbial groups that are going to either fix nitrogen or solubilize phosphorus, or protect the plants. And then as they're in this community, the root structures, they're going to share and transfer a lot of those nutrients across those root systems. And again, as I mentioned earlier, having a diversity in your species is really going to keep the weed management in terms of, if you continue to say have monocrops and putting them in the same rotation, you tend to have a certain weed ecology happening. And if you put that diversity in there, we call it keeps weeds guessing. So it helps in terms of the overall weed management. So we've talked about allelopathy in terms of rye, just that chemical that exuded from the roots that suppresses some seed germination or other plants. And there's more to the weed management in terms of taking away that niche where weeds can get established. C to N ratio, so that's the carbon units to nitrogen in the plant material. So this can affect the plant residue decomposition and nutrient cycling in the soil. So if you have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, so thinking of material that is brown, like straw or corn stalks, this high carbon actually immobilizes or suppresses nitrogen available to your plant in the soil, because the microbes are using the nitrogen to help break down the carbon or the lignins that are in that plant material. Low carbon to nitrogen ratio means that there is, green material, like, your fresh alfalfa plow downs, or your fresh buckwheat. This helps to mineralize nitrogen because the microbes can quickly break down that carbon and then release the nutrients to the plant material in your soil. So low carbon nitrogen cover crops before a high carbon nitrogen crop residue helps to improve nutrient cycling. So balancing out where it fits and where you might terminate it is helpful consideration in terms of cover crop and cover crop residue. The fourth step is choosing the seeding window. That's really dependent upon the equipment that you have available to you for seeding the cover crop. And for mixtures where you have small and large seed, will you blend the seed to put it into one box, or will you put it in multiple tanks? Really has an impact in terms of your method of seeding, and then your timing in terms of seeding rate. So generally, if there's a recommendation for a species as a cash crop, you reduce that or adjust it, because in a cover crop you don't need as much density. And then if you are broadcasting, you need to increase the seeding rate, or if you're doing it in the shoulder seeding time period and it gets later in the fall, you would increase the seeding rate, just to ensure that you get soil coverage and more germination. And if you're using a mixture, generally, if you have a three-way mix, you divide each monoculture rate by 3, and also take into account the seed size, as larger seeds need to be a greater part of the mix by weight than the smaller seeds. And then of course, cost is a big consideration. So if there's something new or expensive that looks like it could be favorable in your mix, you might use that as a smaller component or portion of the blend that has easily available or inexpensive species. There are a plethora of methods of planting. So these are actually from the cover crop guide. These are from most common to least common. This could always change in terms of your context and your equipment, what's available. Air seeder, seed drill, those generally, when you get the seed to soil contact, that usually has the highest success rate. And also you don't need as much seed, but if you're broadcasting it and adding it in with tillage, you need more seed, and then you can put it in a planter. And then there are those opportunities where you might fly it over with the airplane, or now drones that are coming on board. So a number of different ways of planting. The 5th step is determining how you're going to terminate it, because some species will winter kill and others will need more aggressive termination. If spring cover crop growth is important in terms of meeting your goals, you have a very short window. What is your termination plan? You can, if termination is needed, you could use tillage, and you want to consider how aggressive that tillage needs to be, and also there's mowing, grazing, crimping, or any combination of these. But generally, herbicides are not in the organic system. When to terminate the cover crop before the cash crop. And a safe place to start is 2 weeks. I have actually seen situations where there was a very short time period between termination of the cover crop and planting of the cash crop, and the cover crop was not breaking down very quickly. The soil got crusted, and when decomposition is not happening, alcohol is created, and that cash crop was having some very odd deformations. So 2 weeks should be fairly safe period to start out with when you're starting out. And you can also do some adjustments in terms of seeding legume crops into your living cover crop, and that's that's common in winter cereals, and putting in um, clovers or alfalfa perhaps. Very dependent upon your context, of course, and what are your environmental conditions. So if you had a very dry period, terminating cover crops, close to the cash crop planting uses up the soil moisture. And, there's a good discussion about that last week in terms of making those shoulder cover crops to be terminated in the spring, not a viable option, unfortunately. So if you're going along with the plan, sometimes you have to think of plan B or C if conditions are too wet for tillage or termination plan. So it's great to have a winter cover crop, and at least you've had the cover over the winter, and conditions aren't going so well, there still is the option to mow it or terminate it or take it off as a forage. It's great to think about how much flexibility you have in your plan. So termination options: grazing, winter kill, tillage or incorporation. You may not need to terminate it at all. Herbicides, not very limited or not allowed in organic systems, so we take that one out. Mowing, roller crimping, and tarping and mulch are usually only appropriate for much smaller types of enterprises. And in the 6-step evaluation, which is always really important, not just sort of at the end of the season, but throughout the season, did you observe water or wind erosion? That we don't want our soil ending up on the neighbors. Did you observe weed suppression, or did you have weed challenges? Were there opportunities for perennials getting established? And then if termination is needed, how well does that happen? And do you have to use a combination? Also, what is the biomass that is actually provided? Measuring biomass is actually a really great way of an overall assessment of your cover crop, and how well it's growing and your whole nutrient cycling. So you might want to take the opportunity to actually go out and measure it, because that's as much biomass as that's being produced, and you are measuring it above ground. Hopefully that's the biomass that you're actually incorporating, which will eventually be part of your soil organic matter, or at least your available carbon for the microbes to feed on. Are you doing a check strip for comparison? Andy gave some really good advice to John last week in terms of don't bet the whole farm on it, and John, in his wisdom, is saying he's doing it as a trial. That's always good to see. And doing a check strip, you have it right there in your context to be able to compare. And then what is the yield of the cash crop impacted? This is really important in terms of what happens in the present, but what happens in the future. So what's the impact on the crop that comes next? Because I've seen that impact in terms of a cover crop that has a lot of biomass and then is terminated, and the next crop where the cover crop was in and high biomass, there were no armyworms, and right next to it where there wasn't as much cover crop, that cash crop was being inundated with armyworms. So that's a really good contrast. So sometimes it's not just what's happening in this present moment, but how is it impacting going forward, is always good to monitor. So, in-field monitoring, you're out there looking at the root systems, your soil structure, your water infiltration, and you may even do some, lab soil tests, particularly some of those biological tests that we've incorporated in terms of soil respiration. You're feeding the microbes. There would be an expectation that there might be an elevation of soil respiration because they're working. How did that turn out in terms of the cover crops? If you intended it for grazing, were you able to graze? How did you add in grazing days, additional capacity, or reducing some of your cost of forage requirements, and soil organic matter values changing, and that's a long-term thing. So that you would expect that measurement after 4 or 5 years at best. So conclusions is, whenever you're trying something, what went right, what went wrong, and did you meet your goals? And, in terms of your immediate or short-term goals or long-term goals. And then you start asking yourself what might have been improved, and putting that into going forward and to your next cash crop. What adjustments can you make in terms of your tillage and your crop residue practices? Are there opportunities to combine, some tillage and cover crop seeding, or your general, fall management? Are there adjustments that you need to your weed management? And also, are there adjustments that you can make in your fertility plans? And hopefully that's reducing your requirement for additional inputs, because the cover crops there are helping to cycle those nutrients and make them readily available to the next crops. And that is my overview of the considerations in terms of the cover crops, from evaluating what is it you need, setting your goals, determining, what your species are, and then how you're going to get it there, how you're going to put it in the ground, how you're going to terminate it, and how you're going to evaluate it.